day. Today's Torah portion is Toldot, which can be found on page, if you're in the blue Scroll Chumash that we use in the synagogue, it's page 124. And if you are in any other Chumash, it's chapter 25 of Genesis, verse 19. So let's begin with the name of the Parsha. The name of the Parsha is Toldot. The word Toldot means offspring, generations. Ela Toldot Yitzchak ben Abraham. We're now going to tell the story of the children, the generations of Isaac, who was the son of Abraham. We all know that Abraham was the first Jew married to Sarah. Isaac was his son. So now we're reading about the second patriarch and how he gives birth to the third patriarch. We know there are three patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We mention them daily in our prayers. And the Amidah, we begin the Amidah every day by saying, "Blessed are you, God, the King of the universe, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." They were the three founders of Judaism, the first ones who recognized God and transmitted that faith in God to all future generations of Jews, including us. And we are the descendants of the great three believers in God. And that's why there's a sentence in the Talmud that says that we are believers, children of believers, Maminim, B'nai Maminim. And there's actually a very popular song now that a lot of the Israel, especially the soldiers, sing when they go to war. Anachnu Mamin and B'nai Mamin. And we are believers, the children of believers. And we have no one to rely on except Almighty God. It's that faith, that extraordinary faith that has stood throughout all the difficult times that we've experienced, including now, that has given us the strength to persevere. So Isaac is the son of Abraham, and we're now going to learn about Isaac and Rebekah, his wife, who we read last week, how Isaac's wife was discovered at the well when she was so kind to extend water, not just for the servant Eliezer, but for the camels. Well, now we're going to read about their family, their children. But before we get to that, there's a famous commentary on the opening verse. The opening verse says, Ve'ela Toldot, these are the offspring of Isaac, who was the son of Abraham. And then there's four more words that seem superfluous. It says, Abraham holid et Yitzchak. Isaac begot, or gave birth. Abraham, gave birth to Isaac. So again, the verse says, these are the offspring of Isaac, who was the son of Abraham. Abraham fathered Isaac, or Abraham begot Isaac. Now we know in the Torah there's no extra words. If there are extra words, it's to teach us something. So the question is the obvious. If I already said that Isaac is the son of Abraham, you don't have to tell me that Abraham was the father of Isaac. It goes without saying. You know, when we call someone to the Torah, we say Yamo, let's say we say David ben Chaim, right? We say the son of the father. We don't then say the father Chaim gave birth to David. You know, obviously that's the meaning of a son, means that the father gave birth to him with his mother. So why the repetition? And here Rashi, the first commentary on the Torah, gives a very interesting and famous answer from the rabbis. And he says like this, that in Hebrew, the word leitz, or in plural litzanei or litzanim, are, you could say comedians, but it's not really comedians. It's sort of like jesters, mockers, skeptics, cynics, okay? They were the cynics, the skepters, the jesters, the mockers, the comedians, so to speak, of the generation of Abraham. And they were going around spreading rumors about Abraham and Sarah. Now remember that Sarah and Abraham had a child miraculously in their old age. How old was Abraham? 100 years old. How old was Sarah? 90. So people started saying, you know, there's always the tabloid news, right? Well, today you see the tabloids in Publix, the checkout counter. But in those days, they had different kind of tabloids. And that was people, the rumor mill. You know, today we have social media, we have all these other venues for people to spew their mocking and jest and all of that. But In those days, there were still people who would spread rumors. And what was the rumor they were spreading? They said, give me a break. Abraham and Sarah gave birth to this child. No way. They're too old. Way too old. Sarah could not have given birth at the age of 91. So what they said was that, if you recall, there was an incident where Sarah was a beautiful woman and she was abducted by Avimelech, the king of Gerar, who ultimately God struck his household and he had to return the wife of Abraham to Abraham. But people said, when Sarah was abducted, taken hostage to the home of Avimelech, she must have gotten pregnant with Avimelech. And really, Abraham is not the father of Isaac. It's really Avimelech who is the father of Isaac. And they were spreading this very insidious, hurtful rumor about Abraham that it's not his child, it's Avimelech's child. Now, why do we call these people mockers and jesters? Maybe it was just a sincere perspective. And the answer is because there's a fallacy that's illogical in their assertion. Because what are they saying? They're saying that the father couldn't be Abraham because Abraham was 100 years old. Impossible, right? So it must have been Avimelech who impregnated Sarah, because everyone saw that Sarah gave birth to the child. But how do you explain a 91-year-old woman giving birth? So just like you can't explain rationally how a 91-year-old woman could birth, you can't explain how a 100-year-old man. The same miracle that God performed for Sarah was obviously with Abraham. So really, they weren't looking for the truth, because if they were looking for the truth, they would have to acknowledge and admit that this is a supernatural event, because look at Sarah, she's 91, but they choose to make a joke about it and to laugh at other people's expense. And, the Torah tells us these stories because unfortunately these things happen all the time in our modern day and age as well. People poke fun and make jokes at other people's expenses. They latch on to something that seems rational or truthful. There's always a little truth in every joke, as they say, but they're really not looking for the truth. They're just looking to make fun and to hurt people and laugh at other people's expense, which is a terrible thing to do, to laugh at someone else's expense. I'm just going to tell you something that I just saw on the internet. One of the soldiers, a reservist who died, I think, on Shabbat. I didn't catch his name, but basically he was a principal in a school in Jerusalem, and he was called up as a reservist, and tragically he was killed in the fighting on Saturday. But they aired a video. He sent a message before Shabbat to his school from the front lines in his uniform saying, I'm going into Gaza. And he asked the students to pray for him. And then he said, there's one specific commandment I want you to do for me. And he talked about how there was once divisiveness in Israel, now there's unity. And he said, no longer shall there be any separation or division or fragmentation amongst the Jewish people, right, left, religious, not religious, Ashkenaz, Sephardic. And then he said to his students, please do me a favor. Don't speak Lashon Hara, don't speak gossip, don't speak slander. And that was his final request, and he was killed tragically. But that was his message. He said, what I care most is that there should be no gossip or slander. So the mockers, the jesters, the comedians were going around saying, this can't be Abraham's son. It must be Isaac was born from Avimelech. Avimelech, the king of Gerar, impregnated Sarah. So what did God do? What God did was he performed a miracle, another miracle. What was the miracle? He made Isaac's face resemble Abraham's face, so that Isaac was a spitting image of his father. And therefore, this silenced all the mockers and the jesters, because everyone took a look at Isaac's face and said, come on, it's so obvious that Avimelech was not the father, and Abraham is the father, because he looks just like his father, Abraham. So that's the reason the Torah says, this is the story of Isaac, the son of Abraham, and then repeats it. Abraham fathered Isaac, meaning everyone said, there's no question about it, Abraham is the father of Isaac. And this miracle was done just to silence those who were making fun of Abraham. Now, that in itself is a lesson that God would make such a miracle, because you may say, who cares what people say? I know the truth. But no, God is sensitive to the feelings of every human being. And when you make fun of somebody, and especially if you say something so hurtful and painful, God intervenes in the case of Abraham to silence those people who was ridiculing Abraham. However, to take this subject a little bit deeper on two levels. The first one is, usually children look like their parents. So why is that such a miracle that Isaac would look like Abraham? God had to change the face and the appearance of Isaac to be like Abraham. Wouldn't Isaac naturally look like his father Abraham? You know the joke I like to tell about this mother who brings her child to the pediatrician for the 1-month visit. And the doctor looks at the baby and says, oh, your baby's so cute. What an adorable, gorgeous little baby. And the mother says, come on, give me a break. You say that to every mother who comes with their newborn for the 1-month visit. And the doctor says, no, I only say it if it's true to those mothers who really have cute, adorable, gorgeous babies. So the mother says, yeah, what do you say to a mother who doesn't have a cute, beautiful baby? So the doctor says, I look at the baby and I say, oh, wow, your baby looks just like you. So, typically a child does resemble the parents. So why the great miracle here? So here we come into some Kabbalistic idea, which is very important and very fundamental. And that is that we know that there are different attributes of the soul, different characteristics of the soul, personality traits. Now, we all have all of the traits, but some people shine more in one trait than another, and others are stronger in another trait than another. Now, when you look at the traits of the soul of every human being, there are 7 emotional traits. And the first 3 traits, our rabbis tell us, were symbolic, or I should say, reflected, epitomized, embodied by the first 3 patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. What are the first 3 fundamental traits and qualities of the soul? There is kindness. That's called chesed. And then there is gevura. What is gevura? Gevura is literally translated as strength. But what it means to say is discipline. Okay? So if the right hand represents giving, the left hand represents severity or discipline or strength, which means the ability to reject, the ability to say no. So every human being, think of a car. You have a gas pedal and a brake. You can't drive with just the gas pedal. You can't drive with just the brake. You need a gas pedal and a brake. You have to know when to go forward and when to stop. Same thing is spiritually and religiously and morally. There are times you have to say yes to things, and times you have to say no. There are 613 commandments. The 248 are positive, which means do them. Give charity, pray, study Torah, put on tefillin, all the mitzvot of the Torah, keep Shabbat, keep kosher. But then the majority of the commandments, 365, are things you have to refrain from doing. Don't eat that non-kosher food. Don't work on Shabbat. Don't speak gossip. So it's about restraining, holding back. Now, every human being has the ability to do both. The ability to show kindness, but sometimes you can't show kindness. What greater example do you need to have than the war right now, right? Of course, you want to have kindness on human beings, but if you're kind to terrorists, you're cruel to the rest of humanity. So sometimes you have to show strength, you have to show power, you have to show. Now, the nature of the Jew is to be kind and compassionate, but sometimes there's no choice. Take a parent who punishes a child to teach them a lesson. Parent doesn't want to discipline the child. The parent doesn't want to say no to the child's desire for whatever, ice cream for dessert, or when they're older, go on a special trip or whatever. It's very hard for the parent to say no and to punish, so to speak, or to show discipline. But it's a necessary requirement for life. because you can't be a moral person by only saying yes. You'll actually get into more trouble in life if you say yes to everything than if you say no to everything. Okay, so every decision that we make in life is a question of, do I do it or not do it? And the question is, sometimes out of chesed you want to do something, but out of gevura you need to say no. Abraham epitomized chesed, and we're not going to spend a lot of time, but all the biblical stories, the tent with the 4 doors welcoming guests, as we saw, Isaac represents strength. We're going to see a big story about Isaac is going to be about the wells, how the Philistines were closing up the wells of his father, and he kept on undigging the wells of his father to state his father's claim on the land and his father's legacy. So being able to stand, and it's in this week's Torah portion, and hold your ground and push back against those who are trying to cover up your father's wells, and have the strength to redig them each and every time until you prevail. So Abraham and Isaac had different spiritual strengths. Everyone has both, but some people are more in one realm and others are stronger in the other realm. Abraham was strong in chesed, kindness, and Isaac in gevura. Now, we all know they say the eyes mirror the soul, but it's not just the eyes. The whole face of a person mirrors the soul. King Solomon says the face of a person reflects their wisdom. You can look at a person's face even before they start speaking, and just looking at their facial characteristics, you could sense, especially if you're intuitive, you could sense their soul's characteristics. If they're a kind person, if they're a refined person, if they're a compassionate person, or if they're a tough, cruel, or whatever other characteristics, they're reflected in the face. So because Abraham and Isaac had different characteristics, it was reflected in their faces. They looked different. And therefore God had to change the face of Isaac to look like Abraham's, because naturally they had different faces and appearances because they have different characteristic traits. However, to take it one step deeper, the truth is they really weren't that different. Why were they not that different? Because they shared something in common, which was that they were both egoless. And when you're egoless, then you realize you're a channel for a particular trait. But it's not about your trait. It's about you just being the vehicle or the channel, the conduit for it. And therefore, the common bond they shared was their egolessness. There's such a word. And therefore, they really had the same trait, which is subservience to God. And in the binding of Isaac, those two traits merged. Father and son went to make a sacrifice, coming from different spiritual qualities, but they met at the same mountain and were ready to perform the same deed. So even though Abraham represented kindness, if you say, I'm a kind parent, and therefore I can't discipline my child because I'm too kind, well, that's a flaw in your kindness, because the kindness is a tool to be a good parent. But your parenthood, so to speak, has to come from a deeper place than your attributes, has to come from your essence. And therefore, if at a time you have to employ strength, right, then you have to employ strength. So these beautiful young soldiers have to go kill terrorists. None of them want to be killing another human being, but they have to, because they recognize the need to defend and protect innocent people. So therefore, they do something that may be not in their character, but they recognize there's a need to it, because it's not about their character, it's about what is necessary. So really, Abraham and Isaac have the same trait, which is complete nullification and subservience to the will of Hashem. One last thought on this subject before we go forward, which I think is very beautiful and insightful. And that is, the verse doesn't say that God changed Abraham's face to look like his son Isaac's. It says God changed Isaac's face to look like Abraham. And the spiritual lesson here is that when you have two attributes, kindness and strength, and one has to yield to the other, one has to conform to the other, or better yet, you have to choose a direction, and both options are good, so to speak. In other words, let's say you have a child and you say, how can I communicate this lesson to my child? I could do it with love and kindness, or I could do it with discipline and severity, right? Sometimes you have to do it with severity, right? Your kid runs out in the street after a ball and almost gets hit by a car. Well, that may be a time where you could reprimand your kid and really be very severe with him. Why? Because you want to make sure the kid really understands this is no joking matter. You don't run into the street. It could cost you your life, God forbid. But the other times you may say, well, I want to teach this lesson to my kid. I could either come heavy-handed, discipline, punishment, or I could sit them down with love and kindness and teach it to them that way. And in many instances in life, you have to choose which, path to take, one of strength and discipline or one of kindness and love. And what it's saying is Isaac becomes like the face of Abraham. In other words, when you have to choose one, it's better to have the severity and the discipline yield to the kindness and the love. That's the preferred path whenever both options are available and suitable. It's going to tell you something interesting. It's a little bit off the beaten path, but it's connected to this. In America, we talk about the right and the left, right? Now, we say someone's right wing or left wing. Now, I'm not going to get into the political side of it, but officially, if I say, what's the difference between left and right in politics or in America, right? So the left projects themselves, although we see now it's a big lie because the progressive left is the ones that's demonstrating for Hamas and for terrorists, even though they claim to be the party of inclusion and compassion and care for the underdog and for the victims and the innocent people. And these are the people who are always saying that we have to worry about the rights of the downtrodden and the minorities. But instead of thinking about the innocent hostages, they're ripping down those signs. But let's not get into the current day event. Generally, conservative people, right wing, means more law and order and restrictions and so on. And left wing is more permissiveness and forgiveness and compassion. That's what they project themselves to be. Without getting into whether that's right or wrong, I just want to show you that in Hebrew, the word yamin represents compassion. The right hand is the hand of giving, of compassion. Left is restraint, which is the opposite of what we think of right and left in our society. And why is that so? And by the way, when we wash our hands, we put our hands together after we wash our hands. The idea of balance of both. We all need balance of both. And that's the third patriarch, Jacob. He is the integration of both qualities, which is called beauty, tiferet, compassion, bringing kindness and strength together. But the point is that precisely the person who by nature is more of a giver, that person has to learn the art of restraint, because sometimes when you're too much of a giver, it could have a detrimental effect. Now, there's good, healthy giving, but sometimes there could be unhealthy giving. So sometimes a parent is told, you need to show tough love. You're becoming an enabler. You're letting your kid get away with so much, and you just keep on supporting them in their bad habits. So it's the person who is the yamin, the compassionate one, that has to learn the trait of restraint. And it's the person who is by nature very full of judgment and severity, and has to learn to balance that with the trait of compassion. So let's go back to our subject here, which is Abraham and Isaac. Let's go on to the second idea in the story of the Parsha. So how does the Parsha begin? It begins with the children of Sarah and Abraham, which is Isaac, and the daughter-in-law Rebecca, not being able to conceive. Now, if you remember, Isaac was 40 years old when he got married, and for 20 years they couldn't have children. And so they pray for children. Now, this is not an uncommon theme that the patriarchs and the matriarchs had difficulty having children, which is another discussion. Why didn't it come easy, fertility? And one answer is that in life, if you look at the Jewish people, what are we obsessed with? One of the things we're obsessed with is our children. Because our children is everything. It's our continuity. We say, teach it to your children, teaching Torah. It's all about our children. And maybe they had difficulty having children because in life, whatever comes difficult to you, you appreciate more. And therefore, you prioritize it more. So by God making them pray and work hard to have children, this established the Jewish dedication, devotion, passion for our children. Just a side note, but going back to the Parshat, you can't have children. So the Torah says that Isaac and his wife Rebecca prayed to God for children. And finally, Rebecca gives birth, or I should say becomes pregnant. She becomes pregnant. Now, before we get to the pregnancy and the birth, which is the next subject in the Torah portion, when the Torah talks about the couple, Isaac and his wife, Rebecca, and remember, Rebecca's the girl who was found at the well by Eliezer and came back to marry Isaac, the second patriarch of the Jewish people, and now they can't have children. After 20 years, they have a child, but they pray. The Torah says, "Vayetar Yitzchak Hashem." Isaac entreated God, which is a form of prayer. And here's the key word: linochach ishto. Linochach means opposite his wife. So that's an odd expression. Isaac prayed opposite his wife. What does that mean, opposite his wife? So Rashi gives a simple answer. Each one prayed in another corner of the house, of the room, so to speak. But that's just the physical location. What it really means to say is that each one, and this is a very beautiful idea, prayed on behalf of the other. Sometimes you hear a couple say, or a person say, maybe I don't deserve it, God, but my wife deserves it. Do it for my wife. Or the wife says, for my husband, right? Or my child. Maybe I'm not worthy, but for my son, he deserves it, or something like that. Each one said, in the merit of the other, God should grant this prayer that we should have children. Isaac couldn't tolerate to see his wife in pain, suffering without children, being barren, and Rebecca couldn't tolerate to see her husband. So we're told that each one prays for the other, on behalf of the other. And sure enough, God answers the prayers, and she becomes pregnant. But here's the interesting point, and the rabbis pick up on it. It says, and God answered his prayer. Now, if they were both praying, why doesn't it say God answered their prayer? And Rashi gives the following answer. Rashi says, God did answer both of their prayers, but specifically his. Why specifically his? Because there's a major difference between Isaac and Rebecca. They were both righteous individuals. The only difference is that Isaac had a father like Abraham, who was also righteous, versus Rebecca had a father by the name of Bethuel, who was an idol worshiper. So God answers the prayer of the child, Isaac, who has a father who's righteous as well, prioritizing his prayer over Rebecca's, who didn't have a righteous father, because there's your prayers and then the merit of your ancestors. Isaac had the merit of his ancestor, of his father Abraham. That's Rashi's answer. And it brings us to a bigger and a broader question. And the bigger and broader question is, we know that a Baal Teshuvah, a person who does not come from a good background and overcomes the challenges of their past, of their background, and becomes righteous, is greater than a person who was raised righteously, right? If you have two kids today, right, one kid grew up in a beautiful home, wonderful parents, got a first-class education, the best schools, the best teachers, the best tutors, went to the best universities, and he becomes a fine human being. That's beautiful. But if I show you a kid who grew up in the inner city with parents who were abusive and neglectful and drugs and problems, and on his own accord became a wonderful human being and an accomplished person, you say that's a much bigger achievement because he had to break through all of his hardships and situational challenges to become who he became. So why would we elevate the prayer of Isaac as the son of Abraham because he has a righteous father versus Isaac, versus Rebecca, who you would think is on a higher level, and her prayer should be more accepted by God because she had to overcome her idolatrous background. So some commentaries say actually that is true. God answered his prayer because remember, he prayed on behalf of his wife and his wife prayed on behalf of him. So when it says God answered his prayer, it means on behalf of his wife, it was in the merit of his wife's righteousness that God answered the prayer. So that would actually make sense that she's on a higher spiritual level because she achieved it on her own. It wasn't handed to her on a silver platter, so to speak. But there's another perspective, which I really think is interesting. You know, the old joke is that Judaism has many hands. Because you ever hear someone teach and say, on the one hand, on the other hand, on the other hand, right? Sometimes you have two truths that are both simultaneously true. So yes, on the one hand, the person who overcame their own challenging background, circumstances, upbringing, and on their own accord achieved it. Like next Wednesday, we're having son of Hamas speaking at our synagogue. I'm assuming you're all going to come listen to him if you're in town, right? What's so special about son of Hamas? Because he grew up in a community and in a home of terrorists. His father was one of the founders of Hamas. And this amazing kid found his way out through his own enlightenment and seichel, right? He said, this is evil, this is corrupt, this is terrible, I'm out of here. And he abandoned his family, left them in Gaza, and moved somehow to America and became a Christian and leads a moral life now and speaks out against the atrocities of Hamas. Now, we have to respect a man like this, right? Because you and I grew up in a nice Jewish home. We were taught from day one, right and wrong, but he was taught all the wrong things. And he, on his own accord, was able to see the truth and reject that. That's an amazing strength of character, right? So Rebecca's on a higher spiritual level on the one hand, right? But here's the way to look at it from the other perspective. You know, when you learn something for the first time versus learning something for the second or third time, when do you have more enjoyment in your studies? I'm assuming that for you, it's the same as for me. It's more exciting to learn something new than review something you've already learned. And one of the reasons why, of course, the obvious reason, it's new, it's exciting. Everyone likes something new, of course. We always like the news because it's new, right? We check in the news to see what's new, not to read yesterday's news again, right? But here's another thing. When I study something for a second time, I have this false assumption that I know it already. So I'm not as devoted to it because, I learned this already yesterday, so I sort of know it already. Now, truth is, I don't know the full depth of it, and I don't remember all the details. But because I have this notion that, I know this already, I'm not as engaged. I'm not as excited about it because I know it already. As opposed to when I'm learning something the first time, I know what I don't know. I don't know this subject. I never learned this. So I'm much more open to it because I know I don't know it. And the same thing could be said between a child like Isaac versus Rebecca. You see, when you have a father and a mother that are righteous, you now have to, you're like a person who's reviewing your studies. I already have parents that are righteous. It comes naturally to me. It was given to me organically. So it takes much more effort to make it your own. So it's not just my father's faith in God. How do I make it my personal faith in God? How do I make it my values? Not just that I inherited it from my parents. As opposed to the kid who grew up without these values, they know they don't know it. And they have to learn it on their own. They have to achieve it on their own. So there's much more excitement because they're engaged in it because they know that trailblazing a new path that their parents didn't give them, as opposed to someone who it comes naturally to. They sort of think, oh, I know this already. My parents showed me this. They taught me this, and so on and so forth. So, and on the other hand, the person who makes it their own deserves more credit than they didn't. I think this ties into it. A lot of times you hear about people who grew up with very famous fathers, right? And you would expect, oh, his father or his parents were so great, surely he's going to be as great. And they don't turn out to be great at all. And they'll tell you that it was very hard because they felt they had to fill their father's shoes. And they couldn't, it was like an expectation. Well, of course, you're going to be as great as your father. And then when they're not, there's only disappointment. So they never were able to identify themselves. They were always in the shadow of their parents. They were never able to assert their own self. They were always trying to live up to the expectations set upon them, as opposed to a kid who grows up in a home that his parents are not successful or not have achieved anything. Then the kid feels there's a much greater sense of pride and ownership. Like, oh, I'm the first kid in my family going to college, right? I'm the first one to get an education. I'm the first. Like, there's a pride of ownership of this is my doing, not just something I inherited from my parents that I get no credit for. So in a way, Isaac had a harder challenge because growing up with a father like Abraham, there was all these expectations, and he had to live up to it on his own accord and make it his own faith, his own religion, not just the one of his father, but that it's his own relationship with God as well. So now we come to the main event of this week's Torah portion, and that is the pregnancy of Rebecca. Rebecca gets pregnant, and what does she sense? She senses agitation in her womb. Something is going on in her pregnancy that's very disconcerting. There's something tumultuous going on, and she thinks something's wrong with this pregnancy. Now, rabbis fill in the blanks and say, what was this agitation? So rabbis tell us something that sounds humorous, but has a very deep message, and that is that when she walked by the study hall of the synagogue, the Torah, she felt a baby kicking to come out. But then when she walked another block, so to speak, by the church, the house of idolatry, she felt the baby kicking again. And she was like, what kind of a confused, schizophrenic child do I have? One minute he wants to go to the synagogue and study Torah. The next minute he wants to go to the house of idolatry. But regardless, she comes to asks God. It doesn't mean she spoke to God directly. I would say she spoke to the sages of the time, the prophets of the time, Shem Be'aver, and said, what is going on? And, today's day and age, you go to your doctor and get an ultrasound, right? But she didn't have that luxury. And here's what they tell her. They tell her, you don't have one child in your womb, you have twins. You're carrying twins. And these twins are not ordinary twins. These twins are always going to be at odds with each other. They're going to be two nations, two regimes. And to quote the message of the prophets, the might shall pass from one regime to the other, and the elder shall serve the younger. Now, who are these two boys that are born eventually in this Torah portion? Jacob and Esau. Jacob is the descendant of Isaac who carries on the legacy of Abraham and Isaac. He becomes the third patriarch, the father of the 12 tribes of Israel, the one who was renamed Israel when he wrestled with an angel. But Esau becomes the one who drifts away from his family's values and becomes the father of Edom, which is the nation of Rome and Western civilization as we know it today. And here we are experiencing all this anti-Semitism in 2023, and it was predicted in this verse 3,300 years ago, because right here God says there will be this power struggle between Jacob and Esau. But who will serve the younger? The older brother Esau will serve the younger. At the end of the day, Rome will fall to Israel, to Jerusalem, as it did. Rome conquered Israel and Jerusalem, but ultimately the Roman Empire fell and the Jewish people returned to their ancestral land. And so our rabbis use Jacob and Esau as the metaphor of anti-Semitism. The rabbis say it's a fact of life, an immovable fact of life, unchangeable fact of life, that Esau will always hate Jacob. just like they were rivals in the womb. This wrestling match began even before they were born. Could be no reason for it in the womb, right? It wasn't over territory, it wasn't over anything. It's an instinctive hatred, an instinctive rivalry and angst and struggle, and it'll never end. Sorry, I don't have better news for you. But that's what the rabbis say. It's a fact. Halacha hi biyadua. Halacha is like it's a law, like a law of physics. There's like a law of physics, and there's a law of physics, and there's a law of reality. And as the Torah predicted it, and as the sages discussed it, that's been the story for 3,000 years. And even in our Western day, when we thought, oh, we're so modern, we're so advanced, people, maybe anti-Semitism is going to go away now. And here we see it in all of its ugliness, as it always was. No different. No progress made on that front, right? So, once again, in the Torah, everything is foretold what is going to happen. And yes, there are a lot of explanations for anti-Semitism, and you could give it reasons. But beyond all the reasons, it's just the way it is by nature. Just like there's good and evil in the world, every human being has good and evil in them. And our job is to actualize the good and to disarm the evil, or to conquer the evil, or to transform the evil, or to transcend the evil, whichever adjective you want. But we all have to wrestle with good and evil. We all have good traits and negative traits, and we have to battle within ourselves. Well, the world, until the Messiah comes, until Mashiach comes, there's going to be good and evil in the world. And therefore, there's going to be those who rise up against the Jewish people and hate the Jewish people. And as we're seeing today, people supporting terrorists. So this is the main event of this week's Torah portion, the twin brothers. Now, there's a lot going on in this week's Torah portion. We just covered the first 5 verses. But to just tell you what's going to happen, an overview of the Parsha that you'll hear more about in Shabbat, there's a rivalry between the 2 brothers. And what happened was, why is Yaakov called Yaakov, and why is Esav called Esav? Esav means hairy. He came out, he was a hairy baby, so they named him Esav. The word Esav is from the word Asui, which means he was like, sometimes you see a baby born with a full head of hair, and you're like, oh, they don't look like a baby, they look like complete already. The word Asui means complete. Spiritually, this means a person who thinks they're done, they're finished, rather than recognize that they're a work in progress. But Yaakov was called Yaakov because the word Yaakov means heel. Not like healing, H-E-A-L, but H-E-E-L, the heel of a foot. Now, why would they name their son the heel? And the answer is because when Esav came out first, Jacob was grasping the heel of his brother Esav. Why? Because he wanted to be the firstborn. He always wanted to be the firstborn. Now, why? Because in the olden days, there were no Kohanim. The firstborn was like the status of the Kohen, who had special privileges in the worship in the temple and service of God. And that's what Jacob wanted. He wanted that privilege, that spiritual privilege. And Esav really didn't care for it, but he happened to be born first. So Jacob is holding on to the heel of his brother. And what happens in this week's Torah portion all revolves around this birthright. And, it's interesting. We have an organization today called Birthright, okay, which means it's your birthright as a Jew. Well, Jacob wanted the birthright of being the older son, because that would entail the birthright of being a Jew, because who would be the spiritual heir of Abraham and Isaac's legacy, Sarah and Rebecca's legacy? So he wanted that, as opposed to Esav, who didn't care for it. So one day, and what was this one day? Our rabbis tell us it was the day that Abraham passed away at the age of 157. The family was sitting Shiva. Jacob was making lentil soup, because the custom is the mourners eat round food like eggs or lentils, because there has no mouth around food. It shows the circle of life that mourners can't speak. There's no opening to the lentils, to the round food. And Esav comes home from a day of hunting in the field. He wasn't even there at the funeral, at the Shiva of his grandpa. He couldn't care less about that. and he says, pour down some of that hot lentil soup. Now, you all know the expression, like a bowl of beans. When you want to say something's worthless, right? You say it's like a bowl of beans. Well, the first one to sell something valuable for a bowl of beans was Esav, because when he comes home from his hunting trip, he says to his brother Jacob, pour that red stuff down my throat. It was red lentil soup. He says, I'm thirsty, I'm famished, I'm starved, I'm tired, I need some soup. And Jacob sees this as his opportunity. He also realizes now more than ever that he's not suitable to be the heir of the legacy of Abraham and Isaac and Sarah and Rebecca, because look at him on the day of his grandfather Shiva. He's out hunting, killing animals. He was a man of the field. So Jacob says, okay, I'll give you the soup in exchange for the sale of your birthright. And literally the words that come out of Esau's mouth is, birthright? What do I need it for? I'm going to die anyways. Like, eat, drink, be happy, because tomorrow you may die. You could have it. And he sells the birthright for a bowl of beans. And now Jacob becomes the legitimate owner and heir to the legacy of Abraham and Sarah, Isaac, and Rebecca. Now, this sale, this transaction is going to have huge ramifications, not only in this week's Torah portion, but in the subsequent Torah portions, because this is where the rivalry between Isaac and Jacob is going to come to a head. Because later in this parsha, Isaac is on his deathbed. He wants to bless his oldest son. And he summons Esau to go prepare him a meal to receive the blessing. And Rebecca, the mother, says to Jacob, while your brother's out hunting, dress up as Esau, go into your father who's blind. He won't be able to see who you are, and receive the blessing. Because you need to be the receiver of that blessing to carry on for future generations, and you purchase the birthright from him. You're entitled to it, rightfully so. And that's the main story of this week's Torah portion. Jacob getting the blessing from his father in lieu of his brother Esau, and his brother's anger and vow to kill him as a result. And at the end of the parsha, his mother, meaning Rebecca, who helped him get the blessing from the father, says to Jacob, you need a split. You need to head out of town. You need to get out of here because your brother's anger, his wrath is upon you and he wants to kill you. And she suggests that he go to her brother's house, Laban, his uncle, where he ends up going, and that's where he marries his wives and has his family. But the main story is the blessing of Isaac, which was intended for Esau, but ultimately received by Jacob, okay? Ultimately received by Jacob. And again, there's mountains and mountains of commentary on the story, much more than we could even scratch in 5 more minutes. But the obvious question is, what is going on here? What kind of a dysfunctional family is this? The father wants to bless one son and the mother's helping the other son usurp the blessing from his brother, deceiving her own husband. And there's a lot of explanations, a lot of theories, a lot of discussions. And a lot of fascinating things, because later Jacob is going to be deceived by his father-in-law when he wants to marry Rachel and is given Leah under the chuppah. And basically Laban says, well, you tricked your father, so what goes around comes around. So that's another whole discussion. But to just leave you with one potential theory of what is going on here, how to view this, and all these stories are lessons for us, Many times in life, there could be a situation where someone has 2 children or more, in this case, 2 children, and the younger child is more capable or more worthy than the older child. And you want to entrust the younger child with whatever it is. However, your concern is that you're going to alienate the older child from you, your relationship with them, if you favor the younger child. So Isaac is the father's like, I don't want to give up on my son Esau. I know he's a bad apple. He's a source of aggravation. He's a disappointment. He's not following in my values, my legacy, my teachings, my principles of faith. But maybe I could bring him back in the fold by showing him this love and giving him these blessings. I could rehabilitate him. Versus Rebecca's view, which is, let's call a spade a spade. Let's face reality. Let's cut our losses and realize we have one son that's just not up to the task. But we do have another son, Isaac, who's very spiritual and and diligent and studies Torah and follows in the path, and he will be our spiritual ear and conduit to future generations. So let's invest in him. And if we alienate the older son, well, what can we do? That's what we have to do to preserve our heritage. So you can see this dynamic, you can see this this agreement between the two parents of how to go about it. One desperately trying to salvage even the bad son, versus the other one that says, look, that son's too far gone. We have to be realistic and work with what we have. So they had this legitimate disagreement. Now, why do they do it in this conniving way? Well, the mother, Rebecca, is determined to see that her son gets the blessing, so she does what she needs to do. But maybe they had a secret agreement. You see, by Isaac saying to Esau, I want to bless you. It was your brother who took away the blessing. Like this, the child's not angry with the father, and hopefully can maintain their relationship with his son and try to influence him in a more positive way. And now, because the one thing Esau had was a good relationship with his father. He loved his father, he respected his father, and Isaac didn't want to damage that relationship in any way. So this is just one of the theories to what was going on there. But obviously, this is quite a fascinating story, and it's going to carry on for a few weeks now because Jacob's going to run away, and then he's going to get married there, and then a week later, he's going to have to come home and face his brother and figure out how to make peace with his brother, which he'll successfully do. No spoiler alert there. But the point is that this is a very fundamental story, and there's a lot of details with a lot of lessons in it all that we'll try to unpack a little bit more on Shabbat when we come to Shul. So if you have any questions, we have maybe a minute or two left. Does anyone want to type a question? I will try to answer any specific questions. Okay. So I wish everyone a wonderful day and look forward to seeing you very soon, God willing. Thank you all for joining the class today. All the best. Bye.